Hi there and welcome to this special 4-part series, Managing ESG Risk, produced by Art of Procurement in partnership with Dun Bradstreet. I'm Philip Ideson, the host of Art of Procurement. I'm joined over the course of this series by Brian Alster, the General Manager of Finance and Risk Solutions, and Rochelle March, the Head of ESG Product, both at Dun Bradstreet. We'll dig into the emerging imperative for procurement to understand the ESG profiles of their suppliers and provide actionable tips and recommendations on how to manage ESG in the context of broader supplier and supply chain risk management. In part 3 of this series, Brian and I discussed the topic of supply chain risk monitoring, which is an issue that is top of mind for every executive right now. We discuss both in the context of ESG, but we also go beyond ESG when Brian shares advice on managing and monitoring supply chain risk across multiple risk factors. I started by asking Brian what impact he has seen on supply chain leaders of the unprecedented supply chain risks that they have faced over the past couple of years.
You're right, it's an extremely important topic that has become much more relevant in the most recent 2 years, 3 years, as we see disruptions becoming more and more a part of our daily lives, whether it's natural disasters like hurricanes or wildfires or flooding, whether it's the pandemic, or finally, we're seeing other supply chain disruptions in different ports for different reasons. Right. Some of it related to the pandemic, some of it related to strikes, and some of it related to just now we're seeing the ripple effects of ports not just being able to catch up. Regardless, it's forcing procurement executives and supply chain executives to be able to pivot and play more off of their front foot. Specifically, being more proactive in how they identify where the risks are and how to mitigate those risks. You're never going to be able to eliminate the risks completely, but being able to mitigate them quickly has become the most critical requirement of supply chain professionals and executives.
Yeah, it's funny, you think about supply chain risk, and it's something within organizations that we kind of try to keep within our companies, and we're mostly successful. So the end consumer wasn't impacted. Now you see, obviously, the highly publicized chip impact across electronics and automotive. And, you know, I go to my local supermarket and there's no milk on the shelves. Suddenly that becomes a consumer issue where all your customers are really concerned about how you're managing risk too, where perhaps before they weren't that concerned about that. And I'm interested, you know, you talked about mitigation being such a key driver, you know, getting ahead of the game. What are some of the most common ways that you see the folks that you work with kind of think about risk mitigation and proactive risk mitigation?
Yeah, so there's really 3 key steps or 3 key topics that companies we work with are focused on. First and foremost, being more proactive in when they onboard these suppliers, better understanding key components that could potentially rear their head as risk. Obviously, historically, geography was always important, but as you start to focus more on what their profile is, whether or not they're financially viable, how well that they manage their own distribution channels, where their factories are and alternative factories are, and they're starting to identify more types of risk. And those risks include things that could also be disruptors like cyber risk and ESG risk. ESG is becoming one of the most sought after pieces of information to add to the risk assessment process. So one is just being more proactive and having a stronger process to onboarding suppliers and identifying those risks up front. Step 2 is to ensure that they have a strong understanding of alternative suppliers in case there's a disruption. And you need those alternative suppliers to be able to focus on geographic location, most importantly. And then you also need to ensure that they have the same quality of product and delivery. And that takes time. It's not something that you can just do today and have up and running tomorrow. So being much more proactive in finding and seeking out alternative suppliers We talk about nearshoring, right, and bringing things closer to the supply chain. Nearshoring is great, but it also typically, depending on where you are in the world, has an impact on cost. And so companies are not necessarily focusing on nearshoring, but just making sure that they have a diverse global supply chain, so that if merchandise coming from the east is clogged, maybe they're looking into the southern hemisphere or the west to alleviate those burdens, where they can still find countries to have lower cost of goods, but not but also in a more geographically diverse location. So that's number two. Number three is really focusing on ongoing monitoring of their suppliers. It used to be that you'd negotiate a contract, you put it in a drawer, and a year from now you'd bring it back out and start to look at it again and review that vendor. Now you need to make sure that you have continuous monitoring, near real-time monitoring of information, so that if a risk profile of that supplier changes, you're understanding the impacts it may have on your supply chain. Those risks can be anything from that company being caught in some compliance challenges. It could be an issue with their labor workforce. It can be an issue geopolitical. And those types of risks need to be monitored to ensure that if the profile changes and becomes more negative, whether or not that company takes action.
That monitoring, do you see that, we've kind of moved, because those organizations that did do, I think historically did some supply chain monitoring, it was still very much, going out, setting a calendar and going and going and finding that information out yourself versus it being pushed to you. So do you see most of the supply chain monitoring now is push based? So you're not necessarily needing to go out and do anything yourself, but you're informed through notifications, through technology, when there are items that arise that need to be subject to some further due diligence.
Absolutely. You want data provided to you as quickly as possible in a most cost-effective manner possible. And so utilizing third-party data is critical because, one, it's validated and verified, and two, it can be delivered without the burden of resources within a company's organization. Monitoring has typically had a barrier to success because of the time, energy, and people-intensive resources it took. In today's environment, bringing third-party data in like Dun Bradstreet makes it easier because that data has been vetted, it has been tied to a unique and persistent ID, and it is confirmed that data can be passed in an easy manner, integrated into a company's existing risk management systems.
And you talked about optionality, in the first couple of points, which is so important from a procurement, well, really a risk perspective, enabling optionality so you have choices, essentially. And you talked about kind of the cost versus optionality trade-off. Specifically, you're talking a little bit about nearshoring, but are you seeing kind of a conversation change where there's it's recognized that you may need to invest in having optionality, but that's perhaps a sound business decision rather than always being a cost-based decision?
Yeah, the first glimpses we saw of this was the polarization of moving away from just-in-time during this supply chain disruption. We saw companies trying to bring as much product or raw material in as possible, and trying to make sure that they could have the goods and materials. By not having just-in-time, they maybe have a higher cost basis, but by getting as much product as possible and storing it, it enables them to weather the storm a little bit better. So they've been having this dichotomy of shifting away from that just-in-time capability. However, we are also seeing a shift to companies also figuring out how to work smarter, harder, to try and identify ways in which they can offset that increased cost. And unfortunately, we are seeing some of those costs being passed to the consumer, as we're seeing in today's environment with the increasing inflation around the world.
Now, you mentioned briefly, we talked about points of data and the importance of data, obviously in monitoring and in the kind of always on monitoring, if you will. What sources of data should procurement be looking at to monitor supply chain and also to monitor individual suppliers for different types of risk that they should be monitoring against?
Yep. So first and foremost, they should be looking at the financial viability of a company and whether or not that financial viability has shifted and degraded. They should be looking at ongoing compliance data to ensure that companies are remaining compliant and that as disruptions become more difficult, they're not cutting corners. You want to make sure that logistically they're delivering goods and services as they've contractually been obligated to. You want to see geographically where they're coming from and if they can diversify their factories in any way, shape, or form. You want to also be able to understand whether or not there are, and this we're seeing more and more need for, is you also want to make sure that you're triggering in on key ESG variables. As companies continue to find labor shortages, we need to make sure that they're utilizing the proper regulatory practices. They're not cutting corners in how they're manufacturing their goods or what sources of labor they're using to maintain their factory capacity.
And I know that you work with C-suite executives, outside of procurement and supply chain. You work with CEOs, you work with CFOs related to the topic of the management and mitigation of supply chain risks and supplier risks. And so I just wonder if you've got any advice or tips of, what should procurement be prepared to actually answer to from a CEO or from a CFO when it comes to risk? What do they care about?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is we're starting to see more and more that global sourcing and procurement organizations, they tend to be seen as cost centers, but we're also seeing more and more CEOs putting revenue targets on procurement organizations and global sourcing organizations. And the primary reason for that is, if you think about it, a procurement organization or a global sourcing professional can have a significant impact on how quickly cost turns into revenue. So cost of goods sold, how quickly they get the contract negotiated and completed, how quickly they onboard the vendor, how quickly that vendor is turned on, that is highly dependent on the procurement and sourcing organization. Additionally, how quickly an organization can pivot when there is a disruption directly impacts the revenue stream of a company. And so what we're seeing more and more of is companies starting to put revenue targets into procurement organizations' goals, not just things like cut vendor expenses by 10%. We're actually starting to see now goals on turnaround time, goals on monitoring, goals on alternative solutions when there's disruptions, and those all tie to the bottom line.
That's fascinating. I think as any procurement professional and leader listening would probably welcome the opportunity to have their goals tied to revenue. Because I think about the role of procurement, and I think one of the challenges that we have for the relevancy in procurement is that, can you really be tied to the revenue side of the business rather than the cost management side of the business? Tying to the revenue, you're being part of a much more strategic conversation. My last question, because it's just really related to that, have you seen those organizations who are starting to be, put revenue-based targets on their procurement supply chain functions? Is that driving the relevancy or the positioning of procurement and supply chain within those organizations, making them a more important part of the business?
Absolutely. It's actually bringing them to the forefront, but it's also forcing procurement organizations to shift their mindset and to shift their paradigm away from cost cut to creative alternative solutions that will drive the bottom line success of the company. And that mindset is not something that's easy to shift, but unfortunately, the speed and cruelty that this market has had and the supply chain disruptions have forced organizations to move quickly to adopt that paradigm.
Thanks for listening to Managing Supplier ESG Risk, a special series from Art of Procurement and Dun Bradstreet. To listen to all 4 episodes in this series, go to artofprocurement.com/ESG Risk. That's artofprocurement.com/ESG Risk.